Hey y'all, how's it going? How's our people? Welcome to the only channel that you can hear Bigfoot stories all day long, and we don't charge you a dime. And if you don't like the stories, we'll give you your money back. We will. Just send us an email, tell us you didn't like the story, and I'll send you back every penny you spent. How about that? Hey, I've got 4 Bigfoot stories in this video, and they're all really good, but the last one's really spooky, and I thought it was great. So I hope you guys enjoy this. Fix you a bowl of popcorn and get comfortable. Let's get into some stories. All right, here we go. Okay, here's an email from Will, and I'm going to say this before I get started with this story. My dog is sitting behind me. I've got a big yellow lab. His name is Chunk, and today is his birthday. He's 14 years old today, and he's old and he can barely get around, but he's doing okay. But he's got a little bit of paralysis of the larynx. That's something that comes with old dogs. And so he's sitting back here breathing like a Bigfoot. And I can't stop him. It's a little bit hot in here, and it's just the way it's going to sound. So I'm sorry to go on and on about that, but if that bothers you, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to bother him. I'm just going to let him breathe. I'm going to let him take in some air because he's doing okay. Okay, here's the email from Will. He says, "Hi, my name is Will, and I was a brick mason for 40 plus years. This occurrence took place on May the 24th, 1994. I know this because I have kept a daily business journal since 1982. Chunk, that just sounded horrible. My former partner and our helpers had moved to Florida, so I was working alone for a few weeks until I could find some help. I met the contractor and followed him south of Birmingham, Alabama into Shelby County. After leaving old half-paved roads, we turned onto a dirt road and crossed a small creek or branch. There was one house as we turned onto the dirt road, but that was it. It was another half mile to the site. They had barely cleared off enough of the property to build the house. It sat on a small knoll above a swampy area in the front and the back. The front and sides had been cleared somewhat, but the back was completely overgrown. The property must have been given to the owner because it was in the middle of hundreds of acres of nothing but trees and crisscrossed with fire roads. I had been working there a couple of days by myself laying block for the foundation, and I was enjoying myself. On the third day, I was topping out the back wall on top of a 4-foot scaffold. I had finished building both corners, and I stepped back to look at my work. I noticed everything had gotten real quiet. I have always worked outside, and I'm used to watching and listening to nature. The birds I had been seeing in the brush had disappeared and gone quiet. It was like a switch had turned off. They had been plentiful for a couple of days, and now they were gone. I figured something spooked them, maybe a dog, but I hadn't seen one. I ruled this out because I threw some peanut butter crackers at the edge of the woods and nothing came towards them. Dogs are very curious, and they love to come onto the jobs and get fed by the construction workers. As I was going from one end of the scaffolds to the other laying block, I became aware that something was moving along the trees following me. After I finished the course of block on the 50-foot wall, I would walk back to the other end and start all over again. Whatever it was following along and watching me. The brush was so thick I couldn't imagine anything walking in there. The trees weren't very tall, and I could see them moving as this thing moved back and forth. I hadn't seen or heard other wildlife, and I knew no human would be half a mile down a dirt road walking in the swamp in that brush to play a trick on me. Besides, the only person that I knew that was there was the contractor, and he wasn't the joking type. I didn't see him again until the job was finished anyway. I started to get a little worried. This went on for a couple of hours as it would trace my footsteps back and forth. I could feel something watching me, but I never could get a glimpse of it. But one thing I knew for sure, it was big. It must have been curious as to what I was doing. There wasn't a water line run to the job site yet, so I had to drive a few hundred yards on a dirt fire road to where there was an old hand crank spigot to fill 50-gallon drums with water where I could clean out the mixer. You know how you get that feeling that you're being watched? I had it the whole time. When I cleaned out the mixer and loaded up my tools, I kept my eyes on the woods. Usually I worked until dark since I was working by myself to get more done, but not on that day. When I got home, I told my wife, and she sort of believed me because she knows I wouldn't make up a story like that. The next morning, the birds were back, and so I was with my shotgun. This was the only time I felt the need for a gun on a job site. Nothing else happened, and after I finished the job, I told the contractor something weird was in there and to tell everyone to be aware. He laughed it off, and as far as I know, nothing else strange went on. When I went back to brick the house, my friend had moved back to Alabama to work. I told him about the ordeal. I knew he wouldn't laugh at me. We had been friends since we were kids. He and I spent many weekends hunting and fishing, and we both knew how wildlife behaves. We've seen deer walk through stuff that a person would dodge, but it would not follow someone up and down a wall for hours. I walked into the woods and I mimicked what I had seen while he watched from the scaffolds, and he couldn't see me. I'm 6 foot tall, but he could follow where I was. He did the same thing, and from what I saw, it had to be at least 6 feet or better to make the brush and trees sway like it had. I never smelled anything, or I never saw a Bigfoot, and I know it wasn't much of an encounter, but it spooked me enough to tell the owner to be careful and keep a watch on his kids. I don't know what it was, but I know what it wasn't. It was not the native wildlife that inhabits that area. I never dreamed anything like this creature would live so close to an urban area like Birmingham, but I suppose they do. Looking at the map, you will see vast areas of undeveloped land. It is the perfect habitat for Bigfoot. This is the first time that I've ever told this to anyone other than those that I have mentioned before. And I really enjoy your channel, so I figured I'd send this to you. Thanks, Will. Well, that's real interesting. Man, you had to work all day with that thing tracking you back and forth on that scaffold? That's unreal. I don't even know what to think about that. But you didn't see it, but what else could it be? I mean, it wasn't a person. You know the other wildlife is not going to track you back and forth like that. It had to be something that could think, and be curious and watch you and move back and forth. But at any rate, it was a great story, and I really enjoyed it. I really appreciate you sending it, buddy. Thanks. Here's an email that I got from someone who wants to not reveal their name. That's no problem. And here's what she writes. And this is really, really a good story. I mean, it's a great story. This event happened in 1979, and I was 20 years old. It was early summer, late spring, and I had spent the night at my friend's parents' new home on Lake Superior in northern Minnesota. It was 40 miles from the Canadian border. It was beautiful country, very wooded, and there were not many houses in this area. I left their house early on a Sunday morning to head home around 7:30 a.m. It was daylight, but not extremely bright due to the forest blocking the early morning sun. I got on the main road heading south. Lake Superior was on my left, maybe a half a mile away, and to my right was forest, huge pine trees and a few other kinds of trees thrown in to make it interesting. As I drove on the main road to head home, I noticed up ahead, maybe a quarter of a mile, some small red lights in a tree. It was on my right, maybe 10 feet from where my car would pass. I noticed the lights from a distance, and I thought, how could this be? There were no homes or power supply in the area, and battery-operated lights didn't exist at this time. This was wilderness, and it made no sense. I slowed down to a crawl as I approached the trees, and I realized the lights were actually eyes. There were 3 or 4 sets of eyes on animals that were crouched down low and tucked into the tree. As I adjusted my vision forward in the front, there was a monkey swinging from a branch. He was taupe in color and his belly was a bit lighter. He had a black mask across his eyes, and those eyes, they were red-orange and they glowed like a light. He had an overhand grip on an upper branch, swinging side to side while staring right at me. He wasn't that big. His body was maybe 3 feet long, plus long, thin legs and arms. The only Minnesota critter I could think of that had a mask was a raccoon, but this was no raccoon. I knew if I told anyone about my sighting, they would tell me to calm down and assure me that this was a family of raccoons that I had seen. I made a point to look at all the features that differentiated this creature from an obvious choice. His face was flatter, rounder, and he had no ears. As I drove past, I checked to see if it had a tail, and it had no tail at all. As much as I wanted to totally stop my car, I was on a windy 2-lane road with no shoulder, and many people drove that way too fast, and I was nervous about stopping. As I passed the tree, I looked for a road where I could flip around and go back, but there was nothing for miles. I continued on, not going back, wondering why the heck there were monkeys in a tree in northern Minnesota. Keep in mind there were no cell phones back then. I didn't have a camera with me and no way to document what I saw. When I got home, I told my parents what I had seen, and just as expected, they all said it must have been a family of raccoons. That was their only response. I checked newspapers to see if any monkeys had escaped from the zoo or private residence, and I found nothing. I wanted to find out what kind of monkeys they were. Remember, we didn't have internet back then, so I grabbed the Encyclopedia Britannica and I looked at all the pictures. I didn't see anything that resembled these creatures. I started looking at all the animal pictures, and I stumbled on a lemur, and it was close. The color of the eyes were right, and it had the mask across its face, but the face was too pointy, and it also had ears. I ruled out the lemurs. They don't live in that area anyway. Now, up until this time, I always believed that Bigfoot existed, but I never associated these monkeys with Bigfoot. I had seen the Patterson-Gimlin film, which is probably where I formulated my theory that a young Bigfoot would look like a chimpanzee, black, sturdier, with a chimp-like face, but that's not what I saw. I filed this experience away, knowing what I saw, but not having any answers. Flash forward to 2016. I loved watching Finding Bigfoot, knowing they would never catch one on film, yet captivated by all the experiences told and the sounds that were recorded. In one episode, they showed a photo of a sloth, explaining that people who have seen a juvenile Bigfoot say this is what they look like. I popped out of my chair like a crazy woman, finally having an answer to my monkeys in the tree from 40 years before. That is what I saw. The sloth is taupe in color, a mask across his eyes, he has a rounded face and no ears. I had seen a bunch of little ones having fun on their version of a jungle gym. What I would have given to been able to go back in time and stop, look around, and find the adults who I'm sure were watching over their children. But then again, after listening to all the stories about actually seeing an adult Bigfoot, maybe I'm fortunate that I didn't stop. I love that story because it's different. It's different than some of the stories that we normally hear. I mean, this thing didn't look like the Patty film or like a small version of Patty at all. It looked like a sloth. She said long arms, 3-foot tall torso, and they were just swinging in the trees and their eyes were glowing, I'm sure from a reflection off of some light coming from her car. But I thought that was fascinating that she put all this together 40 years later and now she knows what she saw. It's an awesome story. She did a great job writing it, and I really, really appreciated this story. Thank you, ma'am. Here's an email from Max. Max is from Australia, and I really wish I could I wish I could read these in their accent, because I love the Australian accent, and I'm sure in their country, their accents differ from region to region like ours does. And I actually I practiced this once trying to do it in their accent, and I'm horrible at it, so I'm not going to embarrass myself. But here's what Max writes. I would like to tell you about something I saw in the bush of the Australian outback. I believe I came face to face with what we call a Yowie. Let me set up the scene for you. Sometimes at night, I like to go for walks. Being out at night without the light pollution around is beautiful. It was on one of these walks when I saw this creature. It was close to midnight, and I was walking through the bush minding my own business when I heard the sounds of footsteps. I stopped walking and started looking around. I heard rustling in the brambles, and I saw a huge head peek out from behind the brush. I am a big man, 1.9 meters tall, and I weigh about 98 kilograms. But this thing was so much bigger than me. The thing stepped out from behind the bush and looked right at me. The drongo must have been 7.5 feet tall. It was very muscular, and it was obvious that this thing could have ripped my head off with one hand. The hair on this thing was light brown, and it had dark, evil black eyes. It looked down at me and growled. Listen, mate, I can't explain to you how scared I was. This big, full-grown Aussie-born man was sitting there frozen in fear like a child. It lowered itself as if to pounce, and then I turned and ran my Aussie butt out of there. I ran for 4 or 5 minutes at full speed. On that sprint, my foot fell into a snake hole, and I was down. I was injured. I looked back, and the creature was nowhere to be seen. So I pulled my foot out of the hole, and I started limping back towards my home. I don't go for night walks now. Despite not being far from my house, I never saw that thing near my house again. Since that night, I bought me a big knife. Not that it would do any good. I think I saw a Yowie, and let me tell you, mate, it's changed my whole outlook on what lives in the outback or even in our world. But even though I was so terrified, I kind of want to see the old drongo again. You know, there's something about it. I've never seen one, but I can imagine seeing something like that, being so scared, and then you kind of get your wits about you, and then you want to see it again. You kind of want to confirm it, or you're just intrigued by what you've seen and you just want to see it again. I understand that perfectly. Mate, thanks for the email. It was a great story, a scary story, and I'm sorry I can't do it in your accent. I would try, but I'm just not good at it. All right, mate. Thanks for the email. This last story is from Billy, and Billy says, I reside and hunt in the Florida panhandle. I've grown up in the woods, and I bury myself deep in their peaceful seclusion every chance I get. I found and subscribed to your channel after my first recent encounter, and it quickly became my favorite due to the manner in which you tell the stories in an open-minded and non-judgmental manner. I will start by saying that I've never given serious thought to the existence of Bigfoot. I love the movie Harry and the Hendersons, and I laugh at Jack Link's commercials. Beyond that, in any serious fleeting thoughts of Bigfoot, I envision them as being a fabled creature of the Pacific Northwest, Canada, and Alaska. My two recent encounters stirred up a memory from the early to mid-90s that I had casually dismissed shortly after it occurred, and now I'm rethinking that encounter. I was one of only a few with permission to hunt a vast tract of planted pines at the time. It was intertwined with old logging roads that I loved to walk. On this morning, it was raining heavily at sunrise, but the system was supposed to move through shortly, so I sat in my truck and I waited it out. When the rain diminished to a foggy mist, I struck out walking, looking for fresh tracks as I moved slowly along the logging roads. After about an hour, I came upon some tracks that puzzled me, as I had never seen any quite like them before. I thought it was very odd that someone would be walking barefooted out there on this chilly, wet morning, but that is exactly what it looked like in the soft, wet sand. The 5-toed tracks were considerably larger than my size 11 boot, and they were much wider too. I followed them until they left the road and entered a thick branch head, maybe 10 yards to the left. There was an unfamiliar odor hanging in the damp, still air that I gave little thought to until recently. I dismissed the experience as odd, but of little interest. Time passed, and I now hunt property that is roughly 15 miles from the previous location. It is a mix of planted pines and brush thickets in the Florida creek bottoms. I had sat in a tree stand in some pines for most of the day. I hadn't seen any deer, but it was a peaceful and relaxed state of mind that only a quiet day in the woods can do for you. As the sun settled below the trees and the light faded, I climbed down and began walking the trail back to my truck. The trail goes around the edge of a nearly impenetrable thicket and comes out on a logging road that leads to a small clearing where my truck was parked. When I stepped into the logging road and turned west toward the pastel colors of the sunset on the horizon, I froze in my tracks. In the twilight, I saw a large, upright silhouette of a hulking figure standing in the road about 50 yards in front of me. It is hard to describe the myriad of thoughts that instantly raced through my mind, but one that immediately jumped to the front was of danger. The relaxed feeling was instantly replaced by a tense nervousness that I have never experienced. I had my rifle slung by a strap over my shoulder, and my first reaction was to bring it to a two-handed ready position in front of me. I didn't point it at the shape because my brain was still trying to convince me that it was a trespasser while my senses were screaming with every fiber that it wasn't. I have known a couple of guys in my life that were over 7 foot tall. One of them was 7'4" tall and was in the neighborhood of 400 pounds. This creature that I was looking at standing in the road was every bit of that or more. But the fact that I had known these big guys is the reason that my brain was trying to convince me that this was a big dude trespassing and not a threat. In the fleeting seconds of the encounter, I knew that we were looking at each other, even though I couldn't see a face. When I had taken my rifle in my hands, I thought I saw its head cock slightly to one side, pause, and then it leaped off the road and went crashing through the nearly impenetrable thicket. I stood there listening to it plow through the thick brush at a speed 10 times what I would be capable of doing until it went silent. It had come out on the other side near the stand where I had hunted earlier. I took a deep breath and exhaled as I realized that I had held my breath through the brief encounter. After a few moments of gathering myself, I walked to where it had been standing, but the road was matted with pine straw and leaves so that there were no tracks. That's when I noticed the same pungent smell lingering in my memories from the experience many years prior. I have thought a lot about the encounter since, and there is no longer any doubt in my mind that it was a Bigfoot. I think it was tracking my steps from when I had walked to my stand earlier, and I don't believe it meant me harm. I believe it was only curious. That encounter likely better prepared me for the one that followed a couple of weeks later. There is a large, roughly triangle-shaped block of woods on this property. The old roads go around the southern point of the block and back down one side. The northern base of the triangle is roughly a half a mile wide and butts up to a thick creek bottom that winds through the property. I had stalked around the point and to the end of the logging road on the other side. It was getting close to sunset, so I decided to save time back to my truck by taking a game trail that paralleled the creek bottom. The trail is good for a couple of 100 yards before the thick vegetation closes in tight on both sides. I had almost reached that point when I heard deer blowing and running out of the bottom into my general direction. The slight breeze was in my face, so I didn't think they had winded me. The deer veered off and I never saw them, but as I continued walking, I found where they had crossed the trail. At that point, I got a good whiff of that smell again. The woods were dead silent with only the faint breezing, whispering through the treetops. Normally, at that time of day before sunset, the woods are alive with the sounds of critters transitioning from the day shift to the night. My reaction was entirely different than the previous encounter. While my senses were heightened, I remained calm and I continued down the trail. Yet I had the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched and followed. It had rained the night before, so my footsteps were silent, but I heard a few faint twig snaps from the dense creek bottom to my left. I broke out of the thick part of the trail and I began walking up the piney hill towards the road where my truck was parked. I have to admit that I felt a sense of relief when I stepped out onto the road and I could see my truck 100 yards away. But after a few steps, I heard one solid wood-on-wood knock from behind me very near where the trail met the road, like someone was hitting a tree trunk with a wooden baseball bat. It echoed through the woods, and I hastened my steps towards the truck. I somehow had the feeling that it knew that I knew it was there, and I now think that the creature was simply letting me know that yes, it was there. I sat in my truck until well after dark, hoping to hear something else, but all remained quiet. I have been hunting there for 7 years, and these are my first encounters there. I'm now fairly confident the creature means me no harm, and is probably as curious about me as I am of him. I certainly hope it does nothing to change my mind of that. It eludes my trail cameras and I never find any clear tracks, only deep impressions made in the pine straw that blanket the ground. I've only told a few folks about the first encounter, and I feel like they look differently at me because of it. All but one who insists that they believe me. That is the only person until now that I've told about the second encounter. I'm not seeking fame any more than I seek ridicule. It happened, and while it isn't exactly a life-changing experience for me, it has changed my perception of what is and what may be lurking in the deep woods. Signed, Billy. Billy, I don't know if I could handle walking down the road at dusk and see the outline of a 7'4", 400-pound creature standing just a few yards in front of me, looking at me. I don't know how you did it, but you did say at the end that it wasn't necessarily a life-changing experience for you, and I can understand that too. A lot of people that really shakes them up, and they have, I guess, PTSD or whatever. I'm glad you didn't have that, and I'm glad it wasn't a violent encounter. And it does kind of follow the theme that they're really curious about us. And I don't think they're real worried about us seeing them. I think there are enough visual sightings that, where the Bigfoot is calm and, he doesn't run away or doesn't run at you. They just kind of stand there and look at you until you make a move, and then they move along, usually in just a lackadaisical manner. All that said, I thought it was a great story. I really appreciate you sharing this with us, and I know everyone enjoyed it, Billy. Appreciate you, buddy. Thanks. Okay, I think that's going to do it for this video. Thank you all for hanging with me this long. I hope everybody's doing okay in this lockdown virus scare. I know it's unnerving and scary. Just stay safe. And here's another thing I don't know. I know when the curve starts to drop, what then? This virus is not going away. So I think we're going to have to stay really conscious of who we come in contact with and who we hug on and love on, and, people that we're around if we want to avoid it. Especially, you don't want to bring this back to your grandma or grandpa, and because the elderly people in our society are most susceptible. So everybody stay safe out there and be self-conscious about what you're doing. And I think we're all going to be okay. We're America. This ain't going to hurt us. This ain't going to hurt us a bit. We'll be back stronger than ever when it's over. Thanks for listening to the video, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Thank you.